Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Et Al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. I am your host, Anna Kate, and I am joined today with our author, John Screnock. He is the tutorial fellow in Old Testament Hebrew Bible at Wycliffe Hall at the University of Oxford. He holds a PhD from the University of Toronto, and he's authored numerous works, including the topic of today's podcast, Psalms 90 to 100, a handbook on the Hebrew text. John, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, we're so glad that you could join us. So this book that you've written, it's a handbook on the Hebrew text. We have these 10 chapters, Psalms 90 to 100. And in your introduction to the work, you say, quote, that the Psalms are best appreciated when read in Hebrew. We might even say that they are only fully appreciated when they are read in Hebrew, close quote. So why is this? Explain to us the significance of the Psalms in their original language.
I mean, what's funny about this is that I've been researching the Psalms and teaching the Psalms in Hebrew for quite a while. You know, there are things that I'm very enthusiastic about and able to pass my enthusiasm on. But I find that when I try to teach Psalms to people who don't have Hebrew, it just doesn't work. And it's a sort of abnormal experience for me. You know, usually things work, but it just doesn't work. And, you know, why is that? Why is the Hebrew so important? I think it has to do with, I mean, I'm a Hebraist, so those are the things I'm interested in. But I really do think, you know, because it's poetry, you know, one way to describe poetry is that, you know, poetry is about language that draws attention to itself, or poetry is about playing with language, that sort of thing. And so, you know, if you don't have the Hebrew, if you're not reading it in the Hebrew, you're really missing something substantial. You know, maybe another way to think of it is like a poem is sort of like an aesthetic object. You know, it's like a painting. You look at a painting and, you know, you can describe, you know, what's there, what it's depicting or whatever, but really a lot of what it is just in the thing itself and the way it looks. And so, you know, for poetry, the way it sounds, the way the language works together. Yeah, I think that's probably why it works best to engage them in Hebrew, and why they're sort of most impactful and for me most interesting in Hebrew. Anyways, yeah.
And it sounds like too you're kind of pointing to the literary style, right? The fact that it is poetry, and the way in which it's written as being kind of fundamentally reliant on the language that it's written in. And that even some of I know one of the famous is like the acrostic style poetry in the Psalms, that we don't get that in English, right? Because the Hebrew words don't start with the same letters as the English words. But there are certain things like that, right? That only come across in the Hebrew.
Yeah, indeed. And, you know, you can appreciate some of those things without Hebrew. You know, you can read what the Hebrew is to people, and they'll hear the beauty of it, right? Hear the assonances and consonants and oftentimes rhymes. You know, there's plenty of rhyme in the Hebrew. But yeah, the sort of marriage of the way that it sounds and the way that it conveys meaning and the meaning that it conveys, that's really the stuff of the poetry.
Yeah. And I hope listeners hear this as my shameless plug for taking biblical languages. It's so important. But yeah, especially in the poetic books. So you talk a little bit also kind of in those initial chapters, you deal a little bit with Hebrew syntax and the form and the way that it influences the way that we read Psalms 90 to 100. And you talk about the te'amim. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how it influences the poetic structure of the Psalms and their interpretation. So maybe explain to us, what is the te'amim, and then how it influences the structure of the Psalms.
Okay, so the ta'amim are, you know, they're also called accents or the cantillation marks that we have in the medieval manuscripts. You know, when we read the Hebrew Bible in editions, it's usually a reproduction of one particular manuscript that, like all these other ones, has these cantillation marks because it's read publicly and there's a way to read it. And in fact, we don't know exactly in their origins what these marks were meant to indicate, whether it's about pitch or various things, and there's theories about this, but no one really knows. But we do know that it has to do with the way that the text is read.
Hmm.
And so they kind of do and don't at the same time, or in two different senses, kind of impact poetics and structure. So what I mean by that is, if you go back, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Yeah.
there are no cantillation marks. There's no ta'amim there, right?
Right.
So in terms of the written text, there's a point, in the life of this text for a very long time, for centuries, where you don't have this as like part of the written text. But any text, particularly poetry, to think of a text as a thing that's written on a page isn't really accurate. Like, the email that you get with the words jumbled up, but you can still read it.
Right.
Because a text is when a reader phonologically sort of realizes what the letters are like cues telling you what language to create. It's not actually language itself. So identifying a text like strictly with something that's written on, parchment or whatever, that's slightly misleading. And so all that to say, in antiquity, even though you don't have the vowels, for example, written, there are vowels there, and there are traditions
Yeah.
of how to read the text. That's another thing, is that nobody went and picked up a scroll from the library and read it on their own. You're always encountering these texts with other people who already have a knowledge of how to read it, or a tradition of how to read it. And there are sometimes multiple ways of how to vocalize or read or understand the poetics or whatever, but there are these traditions of how to read. So all that to say, to go back to the ta'amim, the traditions of how to read the text reflected in the ta'amim, I think, go back quite a long ways and map onto some really early traditions of
Hmm.
something that wasn't necessarily written in the text, but was indeed, part of the text and part of performances and uses of the text. The ta'amim aren't meant to tell us, this is where you should break the poetic line, but they're about prosody. They're about the rhythms and the way the sounds come out and the spaces. And so as a result, they tend to map onto things like line breaks and how phrases are joined together. And I think that there's a reflection of an early way to read these psalms there within the ta'amim. And you can use the ta'amim to get at some of that stuff. We know it's not the only way to read them. The Septuagint, for example, makes a lot of different decisions about where to break lines, but it was a prominent way of reading some of these things. So in that sense, you can get at the interpretations of how these texts would have been lineated, basically, which is hugely important for poetry, where the line breaks are. That's what poetry is all about to a certain extent. So, they're really important kind of gateways or windows into that early situation. Now, there's another sense in which you absolutely have to say, yes, they totally structure and help structure and et cetera, this poetry, in as much as, we're reading this Leningrad Codex, this Masoretic text, and it absolutely, as a text, includes the ta'amim. So
Hmm.
there are consonants, there are vowels, there are ta'amim. All three of these, plus other things, are constituent parts of this text. The vowels, for example, will change depending on what what cantillation mark is used. So to say, well, we'll just take the cantillation out and it's not part of the text, well, it doesn't make sense. You're kind of ripping it. It's sort of an organic unity in that particular iteration of the text that we have from the medieval period. So in that sense, and this series, the Baylor Handbook on the Hebrew Bible, it says, what the author is going to talk about is the Masoretic text. So in that
Yeah.
sense, the ta'amim are very much part of the text that I'm talking about and discussing. And that's something I really like about this book, is that I made a kind of big effort to try to integrate the ta'amim both into the introduction, so that there's sort of a tool set for people to use. And I think it's more than just, here's a couple of accent signs to recognize, but it's not sort of the full picture. It's just enough for you to be able to kind of get what's going on and say, I find that my students that I teach this to will get it in 90% of the stuff they encounter in the Psalms. So that's pretty good. And yeah, then in the discussion of the various Hebrew that we find, trying to bring out what the ta'amim are doing and how that kind of intersects with and overlaps with oftentimes interpretation of the poetics of the text, but some other interpretive decisions as well. So I that's one of the things I'm most pleased with in terms of this book, is the way that I was able to integrate analysis of the Ta'amim into it.
Right. And I think you did really well. I think it's super helpful. And like you said, they do serve as a toolkit a little bit. And they point to, like what you said before, the tradition and how it was traditionally read. And I think that's something that's so unique within our modern time period with reading the Hebrew text, is that for so long, it was not read individually or silently even, but aloud and in a corporate setting. And so it is, I think, very important to understand and to have an understanding of those accent marks, of the ta'amim, how they function, in order to point to the way that the tradition stands in the way that we read this poetry, but also the way, like you said, that we vocalize it, the way that we understand it, the way we hear it. And it just points to the intentionality of not only the author of the work, but of the tradition and of these Masoretes in the medieval period, who are trying to create, to the best of their ability, a representation of what this group of people knew and were used to hearing and reading and listening to. And so I think it's really important, and I think you pulled it off really well. So I
Thank you.
appreciate that.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's something I'm passionate about. It's there in the Ta'amim. It's there in some of our manuscript evidence
Yeah.
as well. Like when you get variants, you know, all the way into the medieval period, but going back through the centuries, these people are not dummies. They read the text
Yeah.
really well. You know, so if we
Yes.
can, even if we don't think that it's part of the earliest text, you know, it would
Right.
be not smart of us to not pay attention to the insights they can give us.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And so this book, you're covering most of book 4 of the Psalter, right? And I wonder if you could give us a few thematic hints here of what you would have a reader of Psalms 90 to 100 keep in mind while reading and translating. So are there any themes that are common, anything that's popping up that you think could be helpful for a reader of these particular chapters?
Yeah, so I mean, themes in terms of content, you know, the biggest thing is you have this, you know, Yahweh reigns series of Psalms. Psalms 90, I define it as sort of Psalms 93 through 100. People do sort of various things, but they're characterized by, you know, this statement that Yahweh reigns, or the statement that he's king, or something like that. And that is sort of threaded through many of these Psalms. There's kind of a cluster or constellation of issues that are related. It's not just the king language. It's also the language of judging,
Yeah.
judgment, justice, you know, shafat, this root that essentially we translate as to judge. And the thing is, you know, you look at the book of Judges, for example, the judges there are not people sitting in a court, you know, adjudicating. You know, they're not judges in that sense. They're leaders. To be a judge means to be a leader. You know, you're in charge. You don't have a dynasty that you pass on and your children become the, you know, that's kind of what distinguishes it from being king. But in a lot of ways, there's a big overlap between the idea of a judge and a king, and, you know, what it means to judge. To judge is, you know, it can be about deciding cases in the courtroom. It can be about, you know, bringing judgment on people who have done something wrong, or positive judgment, you know, giving rewards. But sort of more generally, what all those things have in common is they're sort of about curating like a just society or a just situation, helping things to be, through your leadership, the way that they ought to be. So there's loads of overlap with kingship and ruling. And, you know, the ancient Near Eastern concept of ruling as a king very much involved justice and, you know, helping people to flourish. And so you do see the language of judging often, you know, the main root, shafat. You see this language also threaded throughout these Psalms, and in some places where you don't see the kingship idea. So I think these Psalms are often relating to these ideas. I mean, a couple other elements are the temple imagery. You know, there's a lot of temple imagery in these Psalms. Well, a temple is, you know, the palace of the god. The god is the king of the region, the people, and where they live, the temple is their palace. And so when you get this imagery coming out of the temple, it's very much connected to this, you know, Yahweh kingship idea and Yahweh as judge idea. And the other thing that's interesting is, you know, we see sort of the non-human created things like trees and mountains and rivers, etc. They're often involved in these Psalms. And, you know, in the ancient Near Eastern worlds, one of the elements of a god ruling justly is that there's order in the creation. So when you get earthquakes and floods and things like that, that's like a disorder that can be conceived of as resulting from the God not doing a very good job being king. And so, the way that nature and creation is brought into some of these psalms, I think also has to do with the idea that Yahweh is a righteous king and a good judge who brings justice. Yeah, if you read any of these psalms, you're likely to run into one of these themes that kind of relates.
Yeah. And I think you're right that, you kind of have these themes, Yahweh kingship, you have judgment or justice, and then creation, and they do all kind of flow together. And in some ways, in contrast, to the ancient Near Eastern gods of the time, that Yahweh is king, right? But that he's bringing justice for his people, and that it involves creation. And I think in some ways, Yahweh as creator stands out against the ancient Near Eastern gods, whom we think of certain gods as the god or goddess of fertility or the god or goddess of the sun. But the fact that Yahweh is over all creation, the fact that he's enacting justice for all people, I think does stand in contrast, and that these songs really bring that out. Would you say?
Yeah, I mean, you see a number of these psalms will have a statement like, Yahweh is feared over all gods. He's king
Mm,
over all gods. He's,
yeah.
a very clear sort of statement, something like that, something about the
Right.
supremacy of Yahweh, where,
Yeah.
to the extent that these other gods are called idols. I mean, Second
Right.
Isaiah is very much connected,
Yeah.
and some of the rhetoric there. Yeah, I definitely think it's you're right. It's connected to the Yahweh kingship and judging and all these, the cluster of
Yeah.
ideas.
For sure. Well, that's really helpful. And I think you do a really good job of painting the picture of these kind of themes throughout the book, but also pointing to some of the more specifics. And so I wonder if we could move into Psalms 91. This is a well-known psalm. It has themes of Yahweh as a refuge for his people, the idea of pinions or feathers that he's protecting. I wonder if you can explain the change in voice from third to first person in these verses and how it influences the way that we read this psalm.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a big question. I mean, in Psalm 91, I kind of feel like the interpretive crux, if you will, is there in verse 9, which can be taken in a bunch of different ways, but it's related to sort of globally how we understand the psalm, and in particular the voicing in the psalm. Just a couple days ago, I looked at the NRSV to sort of remind myself of what it does, and it has a single sort of voice and addressee throughout the whole thing. Someone
Mm,
is addressing a sort of singular you and talking about how God's going to protect you until the very end. In the very end, there's a very clear shift where God talks. I mean, so there's one
right.
clue that there are shifts in voice going on, right? You can't get rid of that one.
Yeah.
The NRSV has sort of a little bit leveled things to make the voice consistent. It's interesting because you do get shifts in voice throughout the Psalms and in Hebrew poetry, and sometimes interpreters have this instinct to level those things. Other interpreters sort of try to embrace them and make sense of them. Sometimes it's just kind of tricky to know what to do. But I think in this psalm, there's kind of a way to deal with what's actually going on in the Hebrew in terms of the subject of the verb, the pronouns used for the addressee. That makes a lot of sense. So yeah, one direction you can go is sort of see no shifts in voice until the very end.
Sure.
But at the very beginning, the first two verses, I mean, the first verse talks about this person who dwells in God's shelter. Just talking about
Mm,
the third person, this person. Then the second verse says, I will say about the Lord, and then something that this person says to God. And then you have, for quite a while, someone addressing a you saying, God's going to take care of you. You shouldn't be afraid. And then
mm,
and then there's this verse 9 that's like, what's going on here? So you could take verse 9 as being in the same voice, something like, you have made the Lord your refuge, so things are going to be okay for you. So it's right in line with the stuff that precedes. But it's kind of hard just to make sense of. It's a tricky thing. I guess you have to buy the book to really see,
yeah.
because I'm not sure I have time. But another way to take it is as going back to address to Yahweh, where someone says something to him, you, O Yahweh, are my refuge. The translation I like is, Elyon, another, way to refer to Yahweh. You have set me in your dwelling. You're protected.
Mm,
And then it goes back again to God will take care of you. God will protect you. And so what I think is happening, and if you look at Delitzsch's commentary over a century old on this psalm, he's got it in the translation. First voice, second voice, third divine voice. Like he'll put it in the very translation to make sure you know what's going on with the voicing. And I don't agree with him entirely, but I think he's basically got it exactly right. What's happening is that at the beginning, there's this person saying this thing to God about God, and then that is the person being addressed as you. And then verse 9 just like jumps back and almost reopens the quote or something like that.
Yeah.
And the person is speaking again and saying their thing, and then it goes. It just makes a lot of sense of what's actually happening in these verses, and also the structure. It's kind of splits it nicely in half, and also there's more. It's more meaningful. It's more poetic. There's more oomph to it to hear these different voices speaking throughout the psalm, rather than just trying to kind of make it a flat, okay, it's just one voice addressing one person the whole way through. And again, you
Right.
have the very end where it's crystal clear that there is a shift in voice. So
Right.
hearing these three different voices in the psalm, I think it's a lovely way to interpret it, to make sense of verse 9 and also the opening verses. So the voicing becomes really important. This isn't the only place, but Psalm 91 is a great example of how the voicing in the Psalms is important.
Yeah. I was in high school when COVID happened, and my mom had my siblings and I memorized Psalms 91. Just we were all at home and bored to tears, and this was as a family we kind of did this. And this was pre any Hebrew I had at all. I don't remember if we did NIV or which translation it was, but just rehearse. We would say it in the car on the way to get food or the grocery store or whatever. And I remember saying out like the first verse, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to my God, like immediately, just like that was so weird going from he who dwells to I will say to my God. And then the very next part is you will not, like it goes to second verse. And I remember it being even odd then, not really having anything other than high school English or whatever, but just realizing like, this is funky that, it starts with one voice and it kind of moves throughout. But it is interesting, like you're saying, when you read it in the Hebrew and when you look at how the writer, the author, the psalmist intentionally kind of transitions into the voice, that when you are saying it out loud, when you are reading it out loud, as the Psalms often were, it pulls you as the I. It pulls you as the first person speaker into the psalm. That it's not just he who dwells, but it's also I will say to God, and it really does bring this dimension where the reader becomes a participant in the psalm. And I think it's really interesting how the psalmist does that and makes that shift. And like you said, the kind of just crescendo at the end, with the final shift in voice. And
God's voice breaking in.
God's voice.
Maybe again, it's like we live in this world that's about individuals, and it's about I grab my book and I sit here and read it. Is this psalm better read where you've got at least three people or three different groups reading it together and responding?
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love it. Well, let's move on a little bit to Psalms 94. We're getting into kind of these kingship psalms. And so this speaks of a God who avenges, which is really interesting. And the psalmist calls for judgment for his adversaries. So how does the identity of these adversaries as insiders or outsiders influence one's understanding of this psalm? And you have a really helpful chart on page 168 of the book. I know we don't have it in front of us, but I wonder if you could walk us through that, the idea of insider versus outsiders, and these adversaries.
I think this is similar to sort of, I'm not sure I'd call it voicing, but it's a similar sort of thing. Basically, you have this opening section that describes all these evildoers that are sort of working injustice, and this sort of plea that God would do something about it. And I think even the opening verses, oh God of vengeance, shine forth. That's sort of part of that. So you have this situation that this voice is lamenting. And then in verse 7, it says, they said, God does not see. For me, there's a question of who the they is. So you have to hold on to that, I guess. And then it goes into this like rebuke of people who think that God doesn't see and God doesn't perceive. And again, in very sort of second Isaiah language says, of course God understands. Like he invented understanding. He understands. And eventually he's going to do something about this. But the sort of straightforward way to read it from the beginning on through is that these evildoers are being described and they're the ones who say God doesn't comprehend. And then there's this rebuke to the people who say that. And so it's these evildoers who are receiving this rebuke. but it's kind of weird because in the Psalms, you usually don't have Psalms addressed to the bad guys. Usually the Psalms are
Mm,
addressed to the good guys. Or another way
yeah.
to kind of think about it is insiders and outsiders. And I guess I'd define an insider as someone who belongs to the group that this literature, these Psalms are intended, they're the ones who are intended to receive it. So
Yeah.
almost kind of de facto, the people being addressed are insiders because they're a member of this group that the text addresses. But then if that's the case, how are they evildoers? Because again, going to the majority of the Psalms, when these, wicked people, evildoers are described, they're the ones who are persecuting God's people or the
Mm,
psalmists themselves, What's going on here? It's just kind of a weird to go from one to the other. There's a whole bunch of ways you could understand it. Maybe it is about outsider evildoers all the way through, and sort of rhetorically speaking, this second part in verses 8 and following is rebuking the outsiders, but it's really intended for the insiders to kind of hear that and be comforted by it and have the same sort of knowledge, I guess. But some interpreters say, actually these evildoers are insiders. They're, every community has people that break the rules, I guess. So, these bad people who are working injustice and that we really, the psalmist says we want God to take care of this.
yeah.
They're inside the group. Maybe they're even leaders, unjust leaders, something like that. And they're the ones who say that God doesn't perceive. And then you get this rebuke in the second half that is aimed at them. So they're insiders, but they're bad. So they're getting rebuked. Another way to take it, which is the way I take it, I don't think is the only way to take it. I mean, another thing to say about these texts is that poetry, they're meant to be generative. You can certainly read
Mm,
these things in ways that are well outside the bounds of what an original audience would have understood. But there are maybe multiple ways to do things, and maybe even the texts almost want you to do that in some ways. But the way I read it is that the evildoers are your standard evildoers. They're
mhm,
outsiders that are doing
yeah.
really bad stuff. But then when it says, they said God does not perceive in verse 7, it's like taking a step up, and the they are the voices that said the words in the immediately preceding section. And so it's almost
Mm,
like a summary statement of this opening lament. Oh God, I wish you would do something. Evildoers are persecuting us. They said, God doesn't understand. This is like the conclusion
yeah.
of this lament, and the fact that God's not doing anything is that these people are concluding that God isn't capable. And then those people get rebuked in sections 8 and onward. No, of course God's capable, et cetera, et cetera. And so like in the psalm, you get two different perspectives coming through. It's not about voicing, but you get two different voices, two different perspectives. And the one is like talking to the other. I mean, that's not the only reasonable way to take it, but I like reading it that way. I don't know. I guess the audience can decide how compelling they find that. And again, find more details in the book. But um, yeah, so similar to Psalm 91, something funky is going on, right?
Yeah.
There's something shifting. What is this?
Yeah.
And those are some of the ways to deal with it.
Yeah. And I think that's really helpful that you outline these options and obviously give your preference of the one you find the most viable, but that it does kind of serve as like a summary statement, and that either way, the vengeance of God will reign, that he is going to execute justice. And I think that's the point, right, of
Right.
this psalm, but
Indeed.
that there are kind of these insider outsider elements at play as to who is receiving the justice and who is the justice being enacted on behalf of. And so it is
Yeah.
interesting to see those two things at play. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. And maybe that's, I think we see both of the, whether justice is meted out
Yeah.
against outsider evildoers or insider evildoers, we see both of those things in the Psalms and
Right.
the Hebrew Bible. So both
Yes.
certainly work. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Justice will be enacted, period. Right. So, all right. So another popular psalm you cover in this work is Psalms 100. It's only 5 verses, but it's just as impactful as some of the longer psalms. And you say that it is, quote, a psalm of praise that concludes the Yahweh Kingship series. So I wonder, how does this chapter functionally conclude the Yahweh Kingship series?
Yeah, so this is one of those psalms where, some people include it, some people don't. It does not
Sure.
say, Yahweh reigns. But for me, if you go back to the sort of original constellation of themes that we talked about, it does contain a number of those. You've got temple imagery really clearly, and God is there in his temple. It's that there's sort of a trajectory that leads up to it. So
Yeah.
you have these themes, you have this temple imagery connected to God's kingship, and many of these psalms are praise psalms. By that I mean, specifically the form, imperatives that say praise God, sing to God, yada yada yada, in
Yeah.
imperatives, plural imperatives. And then you get this because, for, key, telling you why you ought to worship him. And Psalm 100 very much does this. It's got these
Yeah.
imperatives, and then verse 5 tells you why, because he's good and his steadfast love endures forever, which, that, by the way, is kind of like a catchphrase for praise psalms. When you see
Yeah.
this narrative text in the Hebrew Bible sometimes where so-and-so says a psalm and praises the Lord, and it just says, God is good, his steadfast love endures forever. You're supposed to like fill in a whole praise psalm there. And it's just like it's interesting that this psalm is used here because I think other psalms could have worked here. And this one is kind of short and pithy. And yeah, the reasons for praise are that one kind of paradigmatic almost statement. But there's these themes going through these Yahweh Kingship psalms, and Psalm 99. I mean, Psalm 99 I kind of see as maybe the high point of the crescendo, and then it almost goes down a little bit in Psalm 100. But it doesn't end just at the very crescendo. So Psalm 99 has temple imagery, has God as king imagery, and it's got this, three times his name is holy, his footstool is holy, and then he is holy to conclude the psalm. And you get these, blank is holy statements really like saliently, like poetically speaking, they stick out like a sore thumb. Each one does.
Yeah.
Kind of a third of the way through, next third, and then at the very end, which to me and to many interpreters is a clear reference to Isaiah 6, holy, 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 where God fills and exceeds the temple, right? And there's this vision of the massive immensity of God. And so Psalm 99 is like painting a similar sort of picture of God ruling in his temple, right? And it ends with, extol the Lord, worship him on his holy mountain, where his temple is, because he is holy. And it sort of propels the reader. That's that imperative to worship God. And so it propels the reader into Psalm 100, where, we just get the reader is sort of allowed to do that by participating in the worship of this psalm. It's all leading somewhere, and Psalm 100 is where it lands.
Yeah.
And for me, it's an appropriate end to this kind of little sequence of psalms that has been going on.
Right. Yeah, and I think its brevity, it does kind of, like you said, it comes off this crescendo of Psalms 99 and it brings it down, and it's kind of like to come back around and like when you restate your thesis at the end of a paper,
Yeah,
right? Where you're like, here
right.
we are again. This is what we were saying all along. And so you also add that the sentiment of the statement, Hu Elohim, or he is God, is not merely to identify Yahweh or Adonai as the same as Elohim, but to stress that his role is to be the supreme deity, not merely a God, but the God. And you say, note the form of the statement in Deuteronomy 4:35 and 39 with the definite article where it says Yahweh hu ha Elohim. And so there's that definite article there. So in context, there's a contrast with God's people and their role. And you note the prevalence of the 1CS pronouns in this verse. So would you explain this contrast between God and then his people, and kind of flesh out for us the use of the definite article in the Deuteronomy verse and the lack of it in the Psalm?
Right. I think there's this, Elohim, if you go back far enough, I mean, not in the Hebrew Bible, but it has in its origins, it's the plural of Eloah, of God, like El, similar sort of word. It's gods, and sometimes Elohim means gods in the Hebrew Bible, plural, lowercase g, plural gods. But obviously, for whatever reason, it is being used as like a reference to Yahweh as God. And I think it's even appropriate to think of it as having an uppercase G, that there's just like a singular figure at some point in the progression of this. Probably it's a plural of majesty, he's not just God, but plural God. But, that use of ha of the article, the article is about identifiability, and specificity. If I say, oh, look at the book behind you, the reason I use the is because I know that you can identify it easily, or if we're telling a story and I refer to the man, you can identify the man because he's already there in the story. So the Elohim, there's something about, this identifiability of it, this almost singularity of it. The God, which God? Well, what's the idea of the God with no context? It's something having to do with supremacy or uniqueness in some way. And I think
Yeah.
that's what that article is doing there. And then eventually you don't need it anymore because it essentially becomes a proper name. It's like Adonai, it's like Yahweh. And, we see evidence of this. You get, like the Elohistic Psalter. Of course, there's different theories about why this is happening. But, we know later on we say Adonai instead of Yahweh. And then, we say Hashem instead of Adonai. And you get these, in some places you actually have the word Adonai spelled out, Aleph, Dalet, etc. So there's these various moments where people use something else instead of God's name. That happens with Elohim, but probably earlier on, that's not the only reason Elohim is being used. But anyways, it becomes a proper noun, right? And you don't need ha. So for me, there's not a big difference, actually, the way it's used in this psalm. There's not a distinction being made with those Deuteronomy passages. It's being used in the same way as the Deuteronomy passage, but because these psalms are where they are in date, you don't need the article. Plus, it's poetry. You can use articles, but certainly if you have a choice to use an article or not, you're maybe not going to use an article in poetry to keep it pithy and short, etc. Yeah, the fact that it says Yahweh, he is Elohim, I don't think that's just merely identifying another one of his names. Yahweh, this is the same guy as Elohim. In case you didn't know, these aren't two different gods. They're the same God or something like that. There's some force to this statement. And it's likely that it's in line with a lot of these other statements that are being made about his kingship, about him being overall gods, et cetera, to say Adonai hu Elohim, Yahweh, he is God, probably has something to do with his supremacy as a deity, which kind of overlaps, I think, with the development of Elohim as a proper name that gets used for Yahweh.
Yeah. And I think you're right that it narrows down that no longer do we need to specify who the Elohim is, right? We all kind of have this understanding that it is Yahweh, but also that then it creates this identity not only around who Yahweh is, but then around who his people are. And so I think that is an important part as well, that to what you were saying about Psalm 100 even a minute ago, that there's a certain way that they praise. And so there's a certain way that these certain people praise this certain God. And it is just kind of specific in the way that Yahweh is identified, that his people are identified, and that the praises to him are given.
That's a really interesting verse because the very next thing it says is, he made us.
Yeah.
And then it either says, not us, like we didn't make us, or
Yeah.
it says we are his, depending on which reading you take from the text critical evidence. But yeah, we are his people, the sheep of his pasture. So know that Yahweh, he is God, is very much connected to this, our belonging to him, like you're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, John Screnock. We are so happy to have had you today. For those of you that are listening or watching online, we hope that you will purchase John's new book, the Hebrew Handbook, Psalms 90 through 100. We are so excited to have this series. If you're interested in other treatments on Old Testament or New Testament languages, we hope that you will check out our Biblical Handbook series. Specifically, we hope you will purchase John's book, Psalms 90 through 100 at BaylorPress.com. John, thank you so much. We're so glad that you were able to join us today.
For having me. It was lovely talking with you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.